Eastern Front, July 1943. The steppe trembles under a storm of fire. Columns of German panzers advance through the dust of Kursk, black crosses glinting under the sun. Engines roar. Tracks crush the earth. Machine gunners scan the horizon. For months, they have been told they are unstoppable. Steel beasts of the Reich, invincible in battle. But then, from a silent ridge ahead, the ground erupts. A thunderous crack, the sound of a Soviet 76mm gun. In seconds, a Panzer IV bursts into flames. Another is hit. And another? The myth begins to fracture. Panic spreads through the headsets. Enemy guns! Left flank! The tanks try to turn, but they are caught in a web of fire, mines, and smoke. For the first time, the hunters feel the terror of being hunted. The age of invincible armor is ending. In the autumn of 1939, the world witnessed a new kind of war. When German armor rolled into Poland, it was not the slow, grinding warfare of 1914. It was lightning. Columns of Panzer IIs and IIIs spearheaded an assault that moved faster than history had ever seen. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Within weeks, Poland was overrun. Towns fell before defenders could even organize. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike were stunned by the speed and coordination of the attack. It was not just the tanks themselves. It was how they moved together. Panzer divisions were not meant to fight alone. They struck as part of a deadly symphony. Dive bombers screaming ahead, motorized infantry close behind, artillery and radio coordination weaving everything into a single, precise strike. No army in the world had seen such harmony between machine and man. When France fell in 1940, it seemed the legend of the Panzer was complete. The French army, once thought to be the strongest in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. German tanks swept across the Ardennes, cutting through terrain the Allies believed impassable. At Sedan, they broke through with surgical precision. By the time Paris fell, the myth of German invincibility was born, and the Panzer was its steel heart. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers described the sound of approaching treads as a kind of nightmare, a mechanical thunder that signaled death. Resistance often melted before the tanks even appeared. Newspapers printed photos of columns of armor parading through captured capitals. For the world watching, one thing was clear. The tank had become the symbol of domination. But myths, no matter how powerful, invite challenge. As the war spread to North Africa, the Balkans, and eventually the Soviet Union, Germany's enemies began to study this new art of war. They noticed something crucial, that the Panzer's success was not only about the tank itself, but the conditions surrounding it. Open terrain, surprise, speed, and air superiority. Remove those, and the steel beast was vulnerable. Yet in 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, few could imagine that vulnerability. 3 million German soldiers and over 3,000 tanks poured into Soviet territory. Cities burned. Soviet armor was obsolete. Communications poor. Command slow. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Entire Red Army divisions were surrounded and destroyed. Still, within the chaos, Soviet engineers and commanders began to learn. They examined the wreckage of German tanks, noted the thickness of armor, the placement of fuel lines, the weak points near the turret ring. Factories far east of the Ural Mountains began designing answers. Weapons built for one purpose: to kill Panzers. And across the English Channel, in laboratories and workshops, British and American engineers were doing the same. They knew the war would eventually return to Europe. They knew they had to be ready. The age of blind fear was ending. The age of countermeasures was beginning. By 1942, the aura of German invincibility began to fade. Every front, from the burning deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of Russia, revealed the same truth. The Panzer could bleed. the first cracks appeared quietly. In the early campaigns, the Allies' anti-tank weapons were crude. The British boys' anti-tank rifle, the French 25mm Hotchkiss gun, and the Soviet PTRD-41. Against the thin armor of early Panzer IIs or the IIIs, they worked, but barely. By the time the Germans unleashed the Panzer IV and the fearsome Tiger the Fern, these rifles became almost useless. So the race began, not to build bigger tanks, but to build smarter weapons. The British developed the 2-pounder gun, a weapon small enough for mobile use, yet strong enough to pierce the side armor of a Panzer III. But the Germans adapted faster. Their armor thickened, and soon the 2-pounder's shells bounced off harmlessly. The Soviets took a different approach. In 1941, as German divisions stormed across Ukraine, engineers in hastily relocated factories began work on new field guns. The result was the 76.2mm divisional gun, known for its balance of power and production simplicity. It could penetrate German armor at medium range, and, crucially, it could be mass-produced in the thousands. Then came the weapon that would make every German tanker rethink his faith in steel: the T-34. It wasn't just a tank, it was a revelation. Sloped armor, wide tracks for mud and snow, a deadly 76mm gun. It could outrun, outgun, and outlast much of the Wehrmacht's early armor. At first, German crews were shocked. It was as if an iron ghost had appeared, one Panzer commander later recalled. But the arms race didn't stop. By 1943, as the Red Army rearmed and the Western Allies prepared for their return to Europe, a global surge in anti-tank innovation reshaped the battlefield. In Britain, engineers introduced the 6-pounder, a powerful upgrade that could destroy even the latest German designs. In the United States, the 37mm M3 gun was deployed, followed by the 57mm Tibimans, adapted from the British model. And on the front lines, soldiers began to receive new man-portable weapons: the bazooka, the Piat, and the German Panzerfaust. Each invention told the same story. Tanks no longer ruled alone. For every new German model, the Tiger, the Panther, the Elephant, there emerged a weapon designed to stop it. Mines grew stronger, shells faster, charges more concentrated. Tactics evolved. Armies no longer fled at the sight of armor. They waited for it, hidden in forests, behind ridges, beneath camouflage nets. The Panzer's supremacy was not just being challenged, it was being hunted. Reports from the Eastern Front spoke of entire tank formations ambushed and annihilated before reaching the battlefield. In North Africa, British 8th Army gunners learned to draw Panzers into open ground and destroy them with well-placed 6-pounder fire. The legend of Blitzkrieg was giving way to a grim new reality, one of attrition, adaptation, and survival. The age of lightning war was ending. The war of endurance and the weapons that terrified the Panzers had begun. The human angle. For the infantryman, the Panzer was more than a machine. It was a nightmare that breathed fire. When its engine growled in the distance, men froze. They could feel it in their bones before they saw it. The ground shook, helmets rattled, nerves broke. Yet by 1943, that fear began to change. Across the Eastern Front, Red Army soldiers dug in with PTRD rifles and anti-tank grenades, waiting in silence for the moment to strike. The courage it took was immense. A man with a rifle weighing 17 kilograms, firing a single shot, stood against 25 tons of steel. But when a round pierced a weak spot, through the vision slit, or under the turret, and the Panzer burned, entire trenches erupted in cheers. It wasn't just victory, it was revenge. The tactical angle. The armies of the world learned that defeating the Panzer was as much about placement as power. Anti-tank guns were hidden behind ridges or built into farmhouses. Dummy positions were scattered to draw fire. Commanders learned to let tanks pass, then strike at their flanks or rear, where the armor was thinnest. In the Soviet defense at Kursk, entire networks of guns, mines, and artillery were arranged in layers, 1,000 positions deep. When the German armored spearheads advanced, they found themselves trapped in an invisible cage. Each kilometer forward meant greater exposure, tighter movement, and deadlier fire. The same tactics appeared in North Africa. British gunners under Montgomery's command learned to fight defensively aggressive, letting the Germans attack, then hammering them with pre-sighted guns and mobile reserves. Panzers that once rolled freely across the desert now hesitated, uncertain where the next shell might come from. The hunters were being hunted. The technological angle behind every battlefield success lay an engineer's quiet brilliance. The study of anti-tank warfare was not guesswork. It was physics, metallurgy, and precision. Penetration depended on velocity and angle. A projectile striking perpendicular to armor had the best chance to pierce it, but a sloped surface, like the T-34's hull, deflected shots and forced the enemy to waste ammunition. This realization changed tank design forever. Meanwhile, new ammunition types, like the APCR, armor-piercing composite rigid, and HEAT, high-explosive anti-tank rounds, gave even smaller guns the ability to kill larger tanks. In a sense, it was an invisible duel between science and survival. German crews began to carry spare track links welded to their hulls for extra protection. Allied engineers countered with shaped charges designed to focus explosive energy into a molten jet that could burn through steel like butter. The tank was no longer just a weapon. It was a puzzle, one that both sides raced to solve. A Panzer's interior was a metal coffin, cramped, deafening, boiling hot. The smell of oil, sweat, and cordite filled every breath. Crews knew that once hit, escape was rare. Fire spread fast, ammunition exploded, and many died trapped inside. When reports spread of new enemy weapons, of Soviet guns that could pierce a Tiger from 1,000 meters, or Allied rockets that could burn through a Panther's rear armor, morale wavered. Some crews painted extra camouflage. Others prayed. The Panzer, once a symbol of unstoppable might, became a burden of constant anxiety. By 1943, on every front, the tide of fear was shifting, from the men who faced the tanks to the men inside them. The leadership and doctrine angle. At the beginning of the war, German commanders were architects of innovation. Men like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel understood movement, speed, coordination, surprise. Their panzers didn't just advance, they danced. Every strike was calculated to disrupt, to disorient, to break morale before the enemy could fight back. But as the years dragged on, leadership faced a new dilemma. Guderian's once fluid doctrine of maneuver warfare began to crumble under the weight of reality. The Allies had learned the formula: concentrate firepower, break communication, and isolate armor from infantry and air support. When Hitler took direct control of tank strategy, insisting on no retreat orders and static defenses, he unknowingly sabotaged the very philosophy that had made blitzkrieg successful. Commanders on the ground were trapped between enemy fire and political orders that forbade adaptation. Meanwhile, Allied leadership learned fast. British and American officers studied the German playbook with obsessive detail. They emphasized combined arms, infantry, artillery, air power, and armor acting as one. It was the mirror image of blitzkrieg, turned against its creator. Soviet marshals like Zhukov perfected it on a grand scale, integrating thousands of guns and tanks into synchronized, layered offensives. What had once been the Wehrmacht's secret became everyone's weapon. The enemy's view, captured German documents and letters, revealed something the propaganda never showed: fear. Reports from 1943 described how Panzer crews dreaded certain weapons more than others. The Soviet 57mm ZS-2 was nicknamed the Needle for its ability to pierce armor clean through. The British 17-pounder, mounted on the Sherman Firefly, could destroy a Tiger I from over a kilometer away. Crews wrote of hearing the sharp metallic scream of shells slicing through the air, and the terror that followed when a single hit could turn their tank into an inferno. One German sergeant, writing from Normandy, confessed, "We used to be the hunters. Now, each time we move, we feel eyes on us. The sky, the trees, even the hedges. Everything hides something that can kill us." The myth of invincibility was breaking from within. The moral angle. The duel between tanks and anti-tank weapons was not just mechanical, it was moral. For every innovation that made one side stronger, another weapon appeared to counter it. The result was a continuous escalation of destruction. Each advancement promised protection, but delivered only more efficient ways to kill. In the ruins of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Normandy, soldiers on both sides began to see the irony. The Panzer, once hailed as the symbol of progress, had become an emblem of industrialized death. The weapons built to stop it were no different. By 1944, the fields of Europe were littered with burned-out hulls of every kind. Tigers, Shermans, T-34s, all reduced to blackened skeletons. The moral weight was heavy. Tank crews spoke of nightmares long after the fighting ended. The screams of men trapped in burning armor, the haunting metallic sound of shells ricocheting off steel. For engineers and generals, these machines were tools of victory. For those who rode them, they were steel coffins with engines. The historical angle. By the middle of the war, the arms race between tank and anti-tank had become a reflection of the larger conflict. An industrial war fought in factories as much as on the battlefield. Every advance in armor triggered a countermeasure in explosives. Every improvement in gun design forced a new evolution in tank shape and thickness. It was a deadly dialogue written in metal and fire, and yet, beneath all the strategy and science, one truth remained. No matter how advanced the machine, it was still men, frightened, determined, mortal men, who fought inside them. And it was those men who would face the decisive test in 1943 on the rolling plains of Kursk. Where the myth of the Panzer would meet its reckoning. It was the summer of 1943, the moment when the fate of the Eastern Front would be decided not by men, but by machines. The Germans called it Operation Citadel, a massive offensive aimed at crushing the Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk. The plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution: encircle the Red Army, destroy its armor, and reclaim the initiative lost at Stalingrad. To achieve this, Hitler gathered his most powerful armored force yet, over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the newest terrors of German engineering, the Tiger I and the Panther. Each was a masterpiece of design. Heavy armor, massive guns, thick steel plates that no ordinary weapon could penetrate. Hitler believed this would be Blitzkrieg reborn, but the Soviets knew they were coming. Thanks to captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and radio intelligence, the Red Army anticipated the assault months in advance. Under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Soviets built something the Germans had never faced before: defense in depth. For hundreds of kilometers, the fields around Kursk were transformed into a fortress. 8 defensive belts, each lined with anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and minefields. Over 300,000 mines were laid in the southern sector alone. Behind them stood layer upon layer of 76mm and 57mm anti-tank guns, camouflaged in fields, forests, and farmhouses. Entire regiments of infantry were trained specifically to ambush tanks. When dawn broke on July 5, 1943, the German assault began. Panzers roared forward under a curtain of artillery fire. The ground shook as Tigers and Panthers led the charge, their shells tearing through the morning haze. At first, they advanced quickly, the familiar rhythm of blitzkrieg returning. But within hours, the rhythm collapsed. The first mines detonated beneath the tracks. A Tiger lost its wheel and burned. Then came the artillery. The invisible storm from Soviet guns dug into the earth. Every step forward became a gauntlet of explosions. Crews tried to maneuver but found themselves hemmed in by smoke and wreckage. Communications failed. Engines overheated. And when the tanks finally reached the Soviet gun lines, the real slaughter began. From every ridge, every tree line, every trench, Soviet gunners opened fire. The ZIS-2 and 76mm divisional guns screamed, shells ricocheting and detonating in waves. At close range, armor-piercing rounds punched through even the mighty Tigers. Soviet Su-152 beast killers. Su-122 self-propelled guns firing massive 152mm shells obliterated entire formations with a single hit. German radio logs from the battle recorded confusion and panic. Commanders reported entire companies lost within minutes. One transmission captured during the battle read simply, Panzergruppe Süd, cannot advance, resistance enormous. Every meter mined, every hill defended. Losses unacceptable. By July 12th, the battle reached its zenith near Prokhorovka, where over 1,000 tanks clashed in one of the largest armored engagements in history. The field was a nightmare of fire, smoke, and twisted wrecks. Soviet T-34s rammed Panthers at close range, while German gunners fired point-blank. The air reeked of burning fuel and scorched flesh. Yet despite the carnage, the German offensive stalled. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's armor, its pride and power, had been halted not by numbers alone, but by an enemy who had mastered the art of killing tanks. The Panzers were no longer the unstoppable storm of 1940. They were trapped inside one. While the thunder of Kursk faded into the steppe, another storm was gathering in the west. By 1944, the Germans faced a new kind of enemy, one armed with overwhelming industry, intelligence, and precision. The Western Allies had studied every lesson of Kursk, every weakness of German armor, and prepared a deadly reply. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they did not meet the same confident Panzer divisions of 1940. They met tired crews, thin fuel supplies, and a new battlefield where the skies, not the soil, decided who lived and who died. In the hedgerows of France, British and American troops brought with them an arsenal of weapons designed specifically to terrify tanks. The British 17-pounder, a gun of extraordinary velocity, became the bane of every German armored crew. Mounted on the Sherman Firefly, it could destroy a Tiger I from over a kilometer away, something unheard of in the early years of the war. German tankers learned to spot Fireflies by their long barrels and painted muzzles, and often ordered them destroyed first at all costs. Then there was the bazooka, the American infantryman's answer to armored terror. Light, portable, and deadly, it allowed 2 men to cripple a tank from the cover of rubble or forest. The British Piat, though crude and temperamental, packed an enormous shaped charge capable of punching through 100 millimeters of armor. Suddenly, the battlefield was filled with invisible threats. A single soldier, hidden behind a wall, could destroy what once required an entire artillery crew. But the most devastating anti-tank weapon was not on the ground. It came from above. The Typhoon, the Thunderbolt, and the IL-2 Sturmovik turned the air itself into an executioner. Armed with rockets, 20mm cannons, and bombs, these aircraft hunted Panzers with surgical precision. The shriek of their engines became a sound every German tanker feared. One pilot of the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force described it simply: "We didn't bomb tanks. We erased them." In Normandy, during the Falaise Pocket, entire German columns were annihilated by rocket and cannon fire before they could even reach the front. Crews abandoned their vehicles and fled into the woods, leaving behind smoking wrecks of Panthers and Tigers. Those who stayed faced the fury of artillery and infantry, equipped with the weapons of the new age: precise, portable, and merciless. German reports from July 1944 are haunting to read. Tank commanders described advancing only at night, engines off by day. They painted their vehicles with branches and mud, desperate to hide from Allied aircraft. In some sectors, Panzers no longer led the attack. They hid behind infantry lines, waiting for an opportunity that rarely came. And when they did fight, they often faced opponents who already knew where they were. Allied air reconnaissance mapped German movements in real time. Artillery zeroed in before the Panzers could even move. The mighty machines that had once rolled across Europe now died under the weight of precision. By late summer, the truth was undeniable. The Panzer, once the symbol of German dominance, was now a hunted relic. Its armor, its power, its fear, all rendered obsolete by the relentless ingenuity of those who had once trembled before it. The legend had fallen, and in its place, a new era of warfare was being born, one where mobility, intelligence, and air power ruled the battlefield. By the autumn of 1944, the ground war in Europe had changed beyond recognition. Where once the Panzers spearheaded every offensive, it now struggled to survive each day. The numbers told the story with brutal honesty. In the first years of the war, a single German tank could dominate a battlefield. By 1944, it took 5 to 7 just to make an impact, and many never made it back. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect them from the skies. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Spare parts were scarce. Entire armored divisions, once proud and feared, became shadows of their former strength. German production still pushed out new machines: the Tiger II, the Panther G, the Jagdpanther, marvels of engineering. But luxuries the Reich could no longer afford. Each was powerful, but each was also a drain on a dying economy. Factories were bombed daily. Supply lines were shattered. A tank was only as strong as the army that supported it, and that army was crumbling. At the front, commanders faced an impossible choice: retreat and lose ground, or stand and be destroyed. Reports from the Eastern Front described entire Panzer regiments wiped out within days by Soviet artillery and airstrikes. In the West, American and British firepower grew overwhelming. The Red Ball Express, an endless convoy of Allied trucks, ensured that no offensive ran short of fuel or ammunition. The Wehrmacht could barely move without running dry. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last great armored thrust, the outcome was already written. The offensive began with 1,400 tanks and assault guns. Within 3 weeks, half were gone. Many were abandoned for lack of fuel. Others were trapped and destroyed in narrow Belgian valleys by American bazookas and artillery. What had begun in 1939 as a revolution in mechanized warfare ended as a slow, mechanical death. The Panzers still fought with ferocity. No one doubted the courage of their crews. But courage could not defy physics. Steel burned just as easily in 1945 as it had in 1939. Only now, the men inside knew it. The German armored corps, once the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, had become a weapon of desperation. Outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered. The legend of unstoppable tanks had finally met the immovable wall of reality, and as Berlin burned, the empire of iron that once rolled across continents was reduced to twisted wrecks littering the roads of Europe. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the fields of Europe were strewn with the carcasses of once mighty machines. From the snow-choked forests of Poland to the hedgerows of Normandy, tens of thousands of burned-out tanks stood as monuments to an age of iron and fire. The Panzer divisions that had once shattered nations now existed only in wreckage. Hollowed steel hulls, melted tracks, and scorched turrets marking the path of a fallen empire. But even in defeat, the impact of these weapons endured. The tank had transformed from a tool of blitzkrieg into the cornerstone of modern military doctrine. Every nation studied the wreckage, measuring success and failure not by ideology, but by engineering. The Soviet Union, whose T-34s had faced the Panzers head-on, absorbed the lessons with unmatched intensity. Their designers built upon the triumphs of Kursk to create the T-54, T-55, and eventually the legendary T-62 tanks that would dominate Cold War battlefields. In the West, the Allies took a different path. The British refined their anti-tank expertise into new calibers and stabilized guns. The Americans, who had relied heavily on mobility and coordination, developed the Patton series, tanks that combined firepower, speed, and production efficiency. And behind it all lay the silent truth of what the Second World War had proven. No tank, no matter how powerful, could survive alone. The age of armored glory had given way to an era of combined arms warfare, where air, land, and intelligence worked as one. In the ruins of post-war Germany, Allied investigators studied captured reports and blueprints. They found that by 1945, German engineers were already dreaming of next-generation armor, guided missiles, infrared sights, even jet-powered tanks. The technology was astonishing, but it came too late. The Third Reich had fallen before its machines could rise again. For the men who had served inside the Panzers, survival brought little comfort. Veterans spoke of their comrades lost in burning steel coffins, of engines turned into furnaces, and of the helplessness of realizing that their invincible machines had become tombs. "We trusted the armor," one former gunner recalled, "but the armor could not save us." The weapons that terrified the Panzers, from the humble bazooka to the massive 17-pounder, had rewritten the laws of combat. They proved that ingenuity could outmatch might, and that even the strongest armor could be undone by the smallest spark of human invention. The tank was still king, but it now ruled a battlefield forever changed by fear, science, and the cost of power. In the end, the story of the weapons that terrified the Panzers is not merely one of steel and fire. It is a story about the limits of power and the ingenuity that rises when human survival is at stake. The Germans believed their armor made them invincible. The world believed it too, for a time. But war has a way of humbling certainty. The Allies did not match the Panzers with greater tanks at first. They matched them with ideas. The idea that no machine is perfect, that no armor is impenetrable, that the smallest weapon, in the right hands, can turn fear into victory. From the farmer's son holding a bazooka in the hedgerows of Normandy to the Soviet gunner sighting a pack gun, through the smoke of Kursk, each proved that courage and innovation could dismantle even the mightiest war machine. The weapons that terrified the Panzers did more than win battles. They ended an illusion. They reminded the world that war is not a contest of who can build the biggest weapon, but who can adapt the fastest when the old ways fail. After 1945, the world rebuilt. Tanks evolved, missiles replaced guns, and warfare entered the atomic age. But the lessons remained carved into the rusting hulls left behind in Europe's fields. That strength without adaptability